climate conflict nexus. Before I go to the speakers, we have to analyze the nexus between the conflict and the climate. Uh, because I belong to a region which is Jammu and Kashmir, which basically is in the heart of Central Asia. And we have been experiencing uh, devastated floods and a lot of issues due to the climate change. And normally the climate change is a global issue, but in our region, beside other issues, one of the main reason, in my point of view, is the ongoing conflicts in the region. And in Jammu and Kashmir, where more than 1 million military troops, paramilitary troops are present in a small valley of Jammu and Kashmir. I think that's one of the reasons which is contributing to the climate change in that region. Because, when there are troops, their presence, they are cutting forests and they are emitting, using explosives and other things which basically contribute to the climate change. And today we have very learned speakers here. One of my colleagues who is a doctor, a PhD doctor, and he is head of the Department of Public Policy in the Number University, Islamabad. He is also from J&K, and I will request Dr. Waqar Ali Kausar to please deliberate on the subject.
Thank you very much.
You can come here, Doctor.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you very much, dear fellows, colleagues, and esteemed panelists. We find increasing evidence between climate crisis and conflicts, which are not only intertwined, but also act as an amplifier and multiplier to economic, social, and political divisions that drive violence. Such divisions are more profound in fragile areas already grappling with political conflicts, having the history of violence and rights abuse. Stats show that in the states with a larger population, political exclusions, and low level of human development, nearly a third of conflicts from 1980s to 2016 were preceded by climate-related disasters. The deep-seated interconnected factors like political exclusion and marginalization and violent conflicts are compounded with climate crisis, which further complicate the socio-political landscape. We witnessed that climate crisis created more vulnerabilities and limited capacities to mitigate environmental impacts on livelihoods. The cycle of conflict and climate is quite protracted and, in fact, vicious in many ways. The government demonstrated their inabilities in many ways in the communities which are battling occupation and resisting them to address the damages and inequalities coming out of climate crisis. But more profound is the systematic inability of communities experiencing conflicts and insecurity and fragility to respond and react to the climate change. Already caught in perpetual cycle of violence, their access to their own resources, land, and support system is weakened, further increasing fragility drivers and impeding to engage in capacity building and their empowerment. For instance, the disputed state of Jammu and Kashmir in the Himalayan region, a region which is home to almost billions of people dependent on fresh water from the contested highlands. This entire area of our state of Jammu and Kashmir is one of the highly vulnerable to climate change due to conflict. India and Pakistan are caught in this protracted conflict over this region since the partition of Asian subcontinent, resulting in massive human and material and social loss. Environmental loss is less talked and discussed areas in Jammu and Kashmir, but rapid shift in weather patterns, flooding, droughts, and destruction of flora and fauna raise the eyebrows of people to explore the possible causes of it. Though the human and political rights are denied to the people of Jammu and Kashmir by the government of India, but the increasing climatic conditions appear to be a new driving factors of conflict, exacerbating already fragile security situation. Besides human rights issues in Jammu and Kashmir, the tension between both India and Pakistan is also dominated by issue on water resources, as Pakistan as a lower riparian raised concern on the reduction of its water share. The construction of large-scale dams in Jammu and Kashmir, issues of flow of water, compounded with climate change issues and resource scarcity is leading to bigger crises. The presence of militaries at the highest battleground of the world, Siachen, located in disputed region of Jammu and Kashmir, is another example where human activity has an impact on climate crisis, exacerbated by persisting conflicts. The line of control, a line which divides both parts of Jammu and Kashmir between India and Pakistan, has a strong impact on its flora and fauna and natural habitat. Jammu and Kashmir witnessed massive floods in past where people from the both sides of LOC with potential to cooperate and collaborate in case of disasters are left stranded. This reflects deeper connectivity between politics, disputes, and climate change in case of Jammu and Kashmir. Amid such serious climatic conditions and challenges, leaving almost 1/3 of the world's population at the mercy of disasters in this region, this requires a pragmatic leadership to think beyond smaller political agendas and biases. This requires a demonstration to show a political will to resolve long-standing issues and develop a collective consensus to mitigate such shared climate challenges. The engagement on conflict of Jammu and Kashmir and for its resolution is essential to address future challenges. This dispute brought many states, particularly two states, to the level of great enmity, which is impacting any joint climate action. This also opened up possibility to see how communities caught in protracted conflicts would cooperate and find climate cooperation a possible window to resolve disputes. There's a greater need that demilitarization and desecuritization of Jammu and Kashmir, given the accentuated nature of climate change, which is also impacting human security and their rights. But however, one must not forget that human rights-based approach to guide policies and measures of climate change mitigation and adaptation are necessary. It is the obligation of states to respect, protect, and prevent human rights harms caused by the climatic situations, particularly the communities, those who are most vulnerable. In the end, I must say that conflicts of Jammu and Kashmir is a case study for the world that unattended disputes have not only human and political cost, but it's also resulted in massive climatic situation which require shared action and response. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Waqas Ali Khalid, for your enlightening statement. Now I will invite Robert Fatiana to have the statement. Please have the floor.
Thank you. Good day. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this important conference today. The connection between climate change and conflict, that is, war and its preparation, may not be clearly understood, but this connection is strong. While individuals are encouraged to recycle, avoid polluting water, land, and air, and some industries, but certainly not all, have to abide by some minimal environmental regulations, militaries are mostly exempt, yet they're among the world's largest polluters. The world's most oil-using activity is military. Environmental damage and the resulting change to the climate are inescapably associated with not only warfare, but also with preparation to warfare. The largest military in the world is that of the United States, and the US is the largest contributor to climate change in the world. The following information pertains to the US war against Iraq of 20 years ago. Although the information goes back 2 decades, it is a useful snapshot of the environmental costs of war. This information comes from the website of World Beyond War. First, the full costs of the Iraq war, at least $3 trillion, would cover all of the global investments in renewable power generation needed for the next 11 years to reverse global warming trends. Secondly, between 2003 and 2007, a 4-year period, the Iraq War generated at least 141 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, more each year of the war than 139 of the world's countries release annually. Rebuilding Iraqi schools, homes, businesses, bridges, roads, and hospitals damaged or destroyed by the war, and the new security walls and barriers will require millions of tons of cement, one of the largest industrial sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And currently, the Gaza Strip is being decimated in a genocidal attack financed by the United States. Rebuilding Gaza will also require millions of tons of cement. Third, in 2006, the U.S. spent more on the war in Iraq than the entire world spent on renewable energy investment. Fourth, by 2008, the Bush administration had spent 97 times more on the military than on alleviating or reversing climate change. And lastly, fifth, the United States' grossly misnamed Department of Defense is one of the largest climate polluters the world has ever known. It is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Military systems are excluded from mandatory reporting on their energy use and emissions. The data on these topics is somewhat limited, but it's safe to assume that due to their reporting exemptions, the known information is probably not nearly as severe as the reality. The military systems of the world cause untold pollution while preparing for war. The United States, with over 900 military bases outside its borders and hundreds within, is the worst instigator. Many of those bases are situated on what would otherwise be farmland. Chemical testing occurs on some, and many house nuclear weapons. Even one small nuclear accident would be disastrous. Within the United States, things are no different. The Department of Defense report from October of 2023 found that toxic chemicals, known as forever chemicals because they do not degrade once released into the environment, are being produced from at least 245 of the U.S.'s domestic military bases. These chemicals contaminate the drinking water for communities in proximity to the bases. How many U.S. bases within the U.S. and around the globe are producing and emitting these chemicals is unknown. The military systems of other countries may also be producing them, thus adding to the pollution the U.S. causes in their nation's supply of drinking water. War itself, of course, amplifies the pollution, with environmental devastation caused by bombs, depleted uranium, and chemical and biological weapons, many outlawed under international law, but the U.S. and its allies seem to believe that they're exempt from such laws. Bombs pollute the land, air, and water, in addition to the horrific slaughter of innocent people. Tanks, Humvees, and other military vehicles have no respect for environmentally sensitive areas, destroying them at will in order to reach some military target that the aggressing nation has identified. Non-hazardous waste during wartime and peacetime is destroyed by use of burn pits and incinerators, both of which cause extensive air pollution, and by burying this waste in landfills, thus polluting the soil. Plants grown in such soil may spread disease to people or animals that eat them. As I mentioned earlier, individuals are encouraged to take steps to reduce our carbon footprint, but the military is not. There is no national or international body that requires reporting by a nation's military, but they are free to pollute with complete impunity. Climate change, conferences on climate change and environmental damage seldom, if ever, address the military's contribution to these existential issues. Media reports about climate degradation may talk about corporate polluters, but seldom about military polluters. Climate change, mainly caused by the military systems of the world, and mostly by the United States, results in numerous other issues. Climate refugees, people who are no longer able to farm in developing nations because the climate no longer allows it, try to enter the global north, which militarizes its borders to prevent them from entering. Nations spend more on preventing refugees from entering their borders than would be required to alleviate the environmental threat that brought them there in the first place. Poverty increases in areas where farming is no longer viable because changed weather conditions do not allow it. An impoverished nation is more likely to suffer from malnutrition, infant and child mortality, and social unrest. But what is any of that when the U.S. can spend billions annually on domestic and foreign military bases, the purpose of which is to threaten the rest of the world? Currently, the U.S., as mentioned, is financing the Israeli genocide of Palestinians in Gaza and has accepted the brutal Indian oppression of the Kashmiri people, both of which situations are environmentally disastrous. Warfare is inextricably connected to climate change. I can recycle all my paper, cans, glass bottles, and cardboard, but unless and until the military systems of the world change, and especially that of the United States, and begin to take climate change seriously and cease its centuries-long aggressions against the world, the Earth's trajectory toward climate disaster will not change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robert Fatiana, for your excellent statement. Ladies and gentlemen, the climate change is resulting in changes to the natural environment that poses numerous threats to our host, the Earth. Thereby, the entire living on Earth is under constant threat. We have seen in response to the human rights abuses, anti-natural actions, the anger of nature. Nature is evident from the tsunamis, from the earthquakes, and other disastrous from nature. Now I will move to my next speaker, Ma'am Catherine. Ma'am Catherine, you have the floor.
I don't know if you can hear me.
I think, huh? Yes, we can hear you.
Much. To the previous two speakers, thank you so much for your very powerful and insightful contribution to this conversation. As an environmental and climate activist and somebody who has had the privilege of being in Kashmir, in Jammu Kashmir specifically, and having worked in Kotli, I understand the impacts of climate change on those very communities. I live in South Africa, a country that has also been dramatically impacted by climate change and disastrous climatic events that have happened in the most recent time. And this is because of not only conflict, but corruption as well, and in this case of South Africa. But what I would like to contribute to the conversation and share are my insights specifically on Jammu Kashmir, where I have seen the impact of conflict and how that has impacted climate change in the communities that are living alongside river basins and alongside the communities that are most impacted. I think both of the speakers prior have spoken about the dramatic impact of war and conflict and how that has a global impact on climate change. In the very community of Jammu Kashmir, where there are vulnerable communities who are relocated because of conflict, they are the first ones impacted by dramatic climate events. Now, we're not saying that these climatic events would not have taken place, but they certainly are exacerbated by climate change, and how climate change has really seen that there are communities that can no longer farm as they used to. Ensure that water access was what it used to be. Because of a change in climate, these things have interrupted those that rely on the basic natural systems and ecosystems in which they lived with. And because of conflict, they have been displaced, they have been moved, and people are being impacted in ways that they have no control over. I want to also just add and share that I think across the continent of Africa, where I've lived and worked for the past 15 years, my work in certain communities across the continent, the previous speaker spoke specifically on climate refugees. I've worked in communities where those communities no longer exist because of the war for water, the war against, the control for land, and the impacts of climate change on communities that used to live in certain spaces, and they have been displaced by war and conflicts and can no longer access the natural environment around them that they were a part of. Now, ecosystems have existed for thousands of years. And humans in certain parts of the world have learned the perfect balance of how to live within those ecosystems, to add value to those ecosystems, and to ensure that they take away a certain value from those ecosystems. But when we start to disrupt the very ecosystems in which we are living, we see disastrous impacts. And that can be seen in many parts of the African continent, in the Congo, in Rwanda, in Ethiopia. And those very countries that are plagued by conflict and war, the impacts of climate change are far worse. In the river basins in Jammu Kashmir, where natural heritage of these unbelievable water bodies exist, but when people are displaced and they are moved because of conflict, these people are, their communities and homes are washed away. Specifically in Jammu Kashmir, there were places and communities that I lived and worked and walked along mountainsides to visit with families and people who have been impacted by the conflict there. And what did we see? We see now that over the past 5 years, those people are most impacted by climatic events that happen. And, it's not just, it's the displacement of these people. We see the displacement of people into areas and spaces that they would not have been. And now they are, for example, the Sahrawi people of Western Sahara are living in unlivable land in the middle of the Sahara Desert where nobody lived before. But because of conflict and war, they have been displaced from their country of Western Sahara into Southwest Algeria in the Sahara there. And they're living there because, firstly, it's unlivable land. The Algerian borders were open to them in 1975 when the war erupted, and they have made that home. It was meant to be a temporary home, but because of conflicts and a continual fight for their self-determination, they find themselves in a place that has become even more difficult with time, in order to live in a place like that where, unfortunately, the impact of climate change has impacted this very vulnerable community as well. I will leave my contribution at that. But again, I just want to say thank you for this very informative and very powerful panel. Let us not forget the people who live in conflict areas around the world and become a very marginalized and very vulnerable community. And the people of Jammu Kashmir are specifically, for me, one such nation and one such people that are being impacted by the extreme weather events because of climate change and because of their displacement by war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Catherine, for your excellent statement, and you have touched the Jammu and Kashmir issue as well and the situation there. I am also from the South Asia, and over past 40 years, 1,300 disasters has taken place in this region. And one of the tragedies that India has deployed over 900,000 troops that are cutting the forests and very fatal to the natural environment, the occupation of the India. Anyway, your enlightening statement will boost our knowledge, definitely. Now I will move to next speaker, Shagufta Ashraf. She is the professor in the Azad Kashmir University. I invite Shagufta Ashraf, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for inviting me today on this very hot topic around the globe when, the climate emergency is on, and we all as human rights activists, we have to, play a role of environmental activist also simultaneously. Dear listeners, the decades-long conflict in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir that has cost human life also has not spared the fragile environment of the region. Wherever there is anthropogenic activity, it is definitely going to cost. the environment, particularly in eco-fragile zones. As India pledges support for environmental protection, at the 29th UN Climate Change Conference, environmental concerns in its own backyard have remained unanswered, particularly in northeastern regions. War in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir and the deployment of about 1 million Indian army led to large-scale poaching of rare species such as ibex, blue sheep, Urian, the sheep, antelopes, and some rare species like the snow leopard, flying squirrel, and long-tailed Himalayan marmot have been pushed to the verge of extinction. Heavy armed presence at any eco-fragile zone is devastating to the environment. Not only it impacts humans, but it greatly endangers flora and fauna of the area. Example is Tosa Medanito, which was being used as an artillery firing range by the Indian Army. 68 people were killed and 37 have been injured over the years due to unexploded shells laying in the meadow, which lies in the central Kashmir's Badgam district that includes children. The Kashmir region is home of 120 to 150 glaciers, but due to heavy military presence that are receding at a pace, if this conflict continues, these resources become scarcer. My friends, the more military presence around these natural resources, the more environmental problems will arise. The glacial snout has been melting and retreating fast and has been in an imbalanced state due to military presence in occupied Jammu and Kashmir, with melting rates being much higher than the accumulation rates. Because once Indian guns emit smoke or soot on the glacial body, it quickly absorbs it, makes it prone to heat, which automatically helps it into recession. 147 glaciers in Jammu and Kashmir regions were reduced 28.82% from 1980 to 2018, and the glacier loss in the region is much higher as compared to the Himalayan regions. Steadily decreasing forest cover in Kashmir, a result of cordon and search operations and human encroachments into the forest, is a direct cause for increasing encounter between humans and animals. When we have eroded or denuded forest areas, which is living habitat of many animals, the cost will be innumerable. We are seeing an increasing number of wild animal conflict, and the reason is military interference. Ladies and gentlemen, Kashmir's dense forest area has been shrunk considerably from 37% of its total area to 11%. Environment of Indian administered Jammu and Kashmir is paying price for Jammu and Kashmir conflict, floods, droughts, lightning strikes, cloudburst, snowstorm, everything is happening. Extreme events are going to increase. Dear ladies and gentlemen, global actions are required to guard our region and ourselves from any more catastrophes. There is an immediate need to take climate change seriously. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Gupta Ashraf, for your excellent statement. Now I will move to my next speaker, our great friend, Ahmed Qureshi. Mr. Qureshi, you have the floor. Thank you very much for your presence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Naqshbandi. It's great to be here and great to join all of you and see all friends here. As a war correspondent, my training did not prepare me, obviously, for the nexus between conflict and climate crisis. It's something that I understood on the ground. So briefly, I'd like to talk about how the intensification of climate change is escalating conflict risks, exacerbating threats to peace and stability. And this is obviously not a shocker just for journalists like me. It's also a shocker for politicians who might sit in offices far from crisis zones. These politicians, for them, climate crisis really is no longer a distant academic issue, but increasingly an immediate concern. For example, a struggling government's inability to address the damages resulting from severe and frequent extreme weather can exacerbate fraught state-societal relationships. I saw that firsthand a couple of years ago, where I'm based in Pakistan, after the historic devastating floods in 2022, impacting 33 million people. So it really played out in front of our eyes. We saw how the relationship between a society and a state is vulnerable to changes in climate patterns. Now, four glaring examples of how climate changes ignited and or sustained armed conflict come from four zones that I just quickly would like to mention: Syria, Mali, Somalia, and Kashmir. A lot of people don't know that the Syrian civil war, which killed around 500,000 people, displaced around 11 million others, was one of the things that really affected it or helped in starting it was climate change. A severe drought hit Syria between 2006 and 2011, devastated rural economy, and drove hundreds of thousands of farmers into cities, eventually contributing, obviously, to social unrest, which obviously erupted into a civil war later by 2011. In Mali, of course, there's an armed conflict, and we've seen how climate change exacerbated tensions between ranchers, farmers, fishermen, and armed groups. And in 2019, grazing land became scarce in one part of the country due to floods. So ranchers headed to water resources already utilized by farmers and fishermen. And obviously, this led to other complications. Armed militias moved in, and tensions erupted between these groups of people who contributed, obviously, directly to national economy. So the economy was disrupted and the political stability of the country. Somalia is another example. Kashmir is very important, where a lot of our hosts really come from here. Kashmir always had the distinction of being one of the highest altitude conflict battlegrounds in the world, where two of the largest standing armies, Pakistan and India, face off each other. But now the region has an added to its list of distinctions another distinction, which is now it's the highest altitude conflict zone in the world, ravaged by a creeping climate crisis that could have devastating consequences for millions of people. But you won't hear about this because in recent days, Jammu and Kashmir has been in international news for another reason: large-scale protests, as Indian Prime Minister visited the area 4 years after India seized complete control of the region after controversial constitutional changes, which, by the way, deepened conflict in a region that remains disputed and pending resolution on UN Security Council's agenda. So Kashmiris protest and demand India restore statehood back to Jammu and Kashmir, which is purely a political issue, and of course demand a restart to stalled political process for eventual conflict resolution. But meanwhile, Kashmir is suffering also a record rainfall deficit impacting agriculture and the livelihood of millions. Kashmir is prone to extreme weather events like Ms. Shagufta, previous speaker, mentioned, like flash floods, cloudbursts, but also unusual high temperatures that damaged recently livestock infrastructure and caused deaths. And just in the past weeks, we saw a snowless winter, the winter of 2024, which is very, very unusual for a region like Kashmir, a snowless winter. It's a new term that the Kashmiris are coming to terms with. So Kashmir is wrestling with climate extremes while risking conflict between Kashmiris and the Indian state on the one side, as we've seen in the recent protest. And on the other hand, of course, there's the tensions between India and Pakistan as the political process obviously stalls in the Indian occupied territory. So these are some of the examples and some of the things that not just human rights activists and not just politicians, but also journalists such as myself are grappling with as we cover conflict zones. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed Qureshi, for your statement. Now I will move to my next speaker, Mr. Shami. Mr. Shami, you have the floor. I think he's not on the line. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I am highly thankful for the speakers for their marvelous statements on the climate change and the conflicts. Uh, let us jointly, let us join jointly to tackle the situation that facilitates the climate change and to end the occupation by the foreign countries, as has happened in our case, the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, which is the people have been put in the huge prison under the occupation where everyone is under arrest. With this, I again thank you all for your statement, and I hereby close the event. Thank you very much.